While everyone's eyes are on Taiwan and a potential war between China and the US, there's actually another country that poses a major threat to China: India. A full-scale war between the two could be devastating for China, and the two countries have already clashed several times on their shared border in the Himalayas. But China has the world's largest military, so how could India be a threat to it? Welcome to Buried Origins. Today we'll discuss how India's exceptional geography makes it a huge threat to China. So let's get into it. Okay, now most people wouldn't think of India as a genuine threat to China, because although India is the world's most populous country, China has a much larger and more modern fighting force than India's. But wars don't happen in a vacuum, and thankfully for India, geography plays a massive role in how wars play out. So, let's do a thought experiment and assume that a full-scale war between China and India breaks out. Now, both countries have nuclear weapons, but let's just assume for a second that they don't use them, because trying to predict how a nuclear war would play out is just a complete guessing game. So in our scenario, neither country wants to risk the total destruction of their major cities, and so they choose to fight it out without nukes. Also, in reality, India would likely have support from the US and China from Pakistan, but to keep it simple, let's just look at India versus China without any of the countries interfering. So how would India go about fighting a military that on paper is significantly stronger than it? It actually likely wouldn't be at their shared border. Rather, India might look south to attack China's trade. Targeting seaborne trade is a major threat to China, because the Chinese economy is highly dependent on that trade, especially when it comes to the import of oil. While Beijing has been trying to build overland trade routes and pipelines to reduce its dependence on seaborne trade, it's still almost entirely reliant on the sea. For instance, a full 80% of China's oil imports and 60% of the country's overall trade crosses through the Strait of Malacca, in between Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, a vulnerability so significant that it has its own name, the Malacca Dilemma. All of that trade goes right past major Indian naval bases in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which would give the Indian Navy a major advantage when fighting the Chinese Navy, as Chinese ships would have to sail at least 1,900 nautical miles from their nearest base to reach those islands, taking their major ships anywhere from 4 to 8 days to reach a battle where they would have no resupply without making the trip back around Southeast Asia. Now, China could divert some trade overland and towards the Straits of Lombok and Sunda here and here, to push their ships further away from India. But roughly 45 to 50% of China's seaborne oil imports originate from the Persian Gulf, and those oil tankers need to cross through the Arabian Sea, where they're immediately exposed to the Indian Navy. There's no way for China to divert those oil imports overland, as its pipeline capacity is severely limited, accounting for only 10% of its overall oil imports. And it can't simply shift suppliers and use the Northern Sea route around Russia, because that route is still frozen for most of the year. Even if it attempted to shift its supply by buying more from African and South American exporters, all of those oil tankers still need to cross the Indian Ocean at some point, as the Panama Canal is too small for the very large crude carriers that most oil is moved on. So an Indian blockade in the Arabian Sea and northern Indian Ocean would be a major threat to China, especially as it would take Chinese warships from the mainland roughly a full 2 weeks to reach the Arabian Sea. China does have one nearby naval base in Djibouti, which it could use to protect its trade in the Arabian Sea, but the Indian Navy, while not very large at a few dozen major combatants, would greatly outnumber the few warships that China could launch from that base. Now, all this doesn't mean that India could easily cut off all Chinese oil imports through the Arabian Sea. Its navy is simply too small, and it would be stretched thin as it would still have to keep considerable strength in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands to protect its eastern flank. So in reality, India could severely disrupt Chinese oil imports and trade crossing through the Arabian Sea, but it would likely be large-scale harassment rather than a full blockade, simply for lack of ships. However, that harassment and the need for China to divert its trade through the Straits of Lombok and Sunda could still end up as an Indian victory if China decided that continuing the fight wasn't worth the economic cost. Now, India would probably have to keep the engagement up for months, as China has stockpiled a massive petroleum reserve for exactly this scenario, and it could likely run its economy off of that for at least a few months. Trying to predict how the naval engagement will go is a bit of a guessing game, because neither of these navies have really been tested and there's never even been a major battle between modern warships. However, there's still one key thing missing from this scenario: the shared border between India and China. That border is in the Himalayas, and therefore large-scale land warfare is entirely infeasible. So neither side is likely to place pressure on the other over land. Instead, the war there would mostly take place in the skies, and when it comes to that engagement, a lot of military analysts predict a grinding war of attrition rather than decisive victory by either side. Now once again, on paper, China should dominate this fight. Its air force outnumbers India's at about 3,300 aircraft to India's 2,200. and overall it has the edge in quality as well. But once again, geography is heavily in India's favor. As in this scenario, China's fighter jets would mostly need to take off from its Tibetan air bases. Those air bases are all at extremely high altitudes, above 11,000 feet or 3,500 meters, where the air is much thinner and therefore its aircraft face severe restrictions on takeoff weight. A Chinese fighter jet taking off from a base like Lasar would face a payload reduction of about a third its normal capacity, meaning either a lot less fuel or less ordnance. On the southern side of the Himalayas, India's air bases are all at extremely low altitude, mostly below 1,000 feet or 300 meters. So India's aircraft would be at a major advantage, able to fly longer and carry more ordnance. On top of that, both sides have dense air defense networks that would likely take considerable time to degrade. That's why many military analysts predicted that an air war between the two would be a drawn-out battle of attrition rather than a decisive victory in the early weeks. So despite the fact that on paper, India's Navy and Air Force are no match for China's, geography is so heavily in India's advantage that India could likely cause severe economic disruption to China in a full-scale war. How successful India would be and how long it could keep it up are impossible to know, but it's definitely not a fight that China would like to have. Of course, China would also have a vast arsenal of economic tools at its disposal, and India's trade deficit with China is huge, so even if India was militarily successful, it would come at a massive economic cost. Well, I hope you enjoyed reviewing how even in the age of AI and satellites, old-fashioned distance and mountains still play a huge role in conflict and geopolitics. If you did, please like and subscribe. See ya.